Revenge films.
A couple of years ago, my mother-in-law passed away. At that time, my family and I were living with her. My father-in-law had already passed, and there was a family grave. So my husband Jonathan, my son Thomas, and I took care of the mother-in-law until her last breath. When my mother-in-law was still alive and healthy, there were often times that she would harass and abuse me, punching and kicking me. But at the time, I didn't want there to be any problems in the family, so I thought everything would be fine as long as I tolerated it and held it in. But then one day, my mother-in-law slipped on a staircase and she fell down and broke her hip. When she was stuck horizontally, she was no longer able to physically attack me, but that wasn't the end of the abuse towards me. Now that my mother-in-law was no longer able to physically hurt me, at the time, she was hurling terrible and abusive words at me. At the time, I wasn't able to take care of her myself, so we had to hire a helper. And my mother-in-law started telling the helper that I was doing awful things to her, to the point where there was no limit, and the helper ended up calling the police because of it. The reason why the helper didn't think my mother-in-law was lying and actually believed her is because my mother-in-law harmed herself and created scars on herself, and they claimed that I did it to her. When the police were called to the house, I did my best to explain the situation to them, and even though I tried to convince the helper otherwise, she glared at me and never trusted me again. I was exhausted that this much was my everyday life. When one day my mother-in-law was crying that her hip was hurting even more than usual, and then we rushed to the hospital. That was when they discovered that she had an aneurysm in her hip, and she was hospitalized. To be honest, once my mother-in-law was hospitalized, I felt a huge weight lift off my shoulders, physically and emotionally. While she was hospitalized, I was demanded to come to the hospital by my mother-in-law numerous times, but then as long as I went home, I knew that I would be free from the torment, so I could tolerate it. As usual, she was saying table-full things about me to the nurses at the hospital. Because nurses have seen all kinds of patients and all kinds of personalities through the years, they could see through whether somebody was lying or not, like a piece of cake.
It must have been really difficult for you with a mother-in-law like that.
And instead, they sympathized with me. Up until now, everybody just jumped right on board with my mother-in-law's nonsense. So when I heard those words from the nurses, it was really refreshing, and I felt another weight lifted off of my heart. From there, I would visit my mother-in-law in the hospital, and she would just spit out awful words at me. And the nurses would come in and try to save me.
Your daughter-in-law is going out of her way to come visit you. It's very rude for you to say that to her.
They tried to defend me, and my mother-in-law seemed unamused that her verbal abuse towards me and that trash talking about me wasn't working. Knowing that there were people that understood my struggle, it wasn't so painful for me to go to the hospital, and it was around that time that the doctors started to tell us that we would begin to prepare ourselves for the worst. And right as we were told that it was about the time to be, our entire family was called to the hospital to her bedside. Even though she was awful to me all these years, my mother-in-law loved her grandson, and she was always kind to Thomas. And then she turned to her beloved grandson and said, "Your grandma is going to be going to heaven soon, but I'll be watching over you and protecting you from there." She said that. A single tear fell down from her cheek. However, when he heard those words, my son said the most unexpected thing to his grandmother.
"Excuse me? Are you kidding me? Obviously, there's no way that you're going to go to heaven after all the terrible things that you said and did to my mom!"
Perhaps those words were extremely shocking to my mother-in-law because immediately after that, her expression changed and she passed away right then. Of course, we were all shocked by the sudden moment that my mother-in-law passed, but we were even more shocked by the words that came out of my son and that said that to her. I wasn't able to hide my confusion even when it came to the funeral. And then, after the funeral, my husband said,
"And now, we can finally live together as a family."
He said that. To our disbelief, this time, my son punched his father. My husband was so shocked that he was punched by his own son that he laid there in shock.
"Even though you never once tried to protect Mom, you have some nerve to call this a family! I've never once thought of you as my family, you bastard!"
He said. But what he was saying was true. Even when my husband could see right in front of him, my mother-in-law was awful to me. But every single time she yelled and such terrible insults at me, my husband would just pretend that he didn't hear any of it and pretended like he didn't see any of it. My son must have been watching all of this all along. My mother-in-law had adored my son, but I remember a number of times that he said to her,
"Stop saying such terrible things to my mom, and please, stop hitting her!"
I'll never forget when I overheard him say that. I can imagine that he knew that my husband wasn't doing anything at all to help me, and my son wanted to do whatever he could to save me. I was so moved by him. In the end, after that, I got a divorce from my husband, Jonathan, and Thomas himself declared that he was going to be cutting off all ties with his dad. Naturally, I received a full custody of my son, and the divorce was settled so that Jonathan would be paying me child support fees every month. However, I barely had any income at the time, and so I said to my son, because I was so rushed to get a divorce, I also wasn't able to get that much of an amount for child support fees, so I'm honestly not sure if I'll be able to send you to high school to pay those school fees. I'm so sorry. But when I said that, my son responded strongly.
I'll get a part-time job and go to high school, so you don't need to worry about us, Mom.
And he smiled. My son was still in middle school, but at this moment, as well as the moment with my mother-in-law, with my ex-husband, I was amazed how much my son had grown up. After that, my son did in fact get a part-time job after school. While working at school full-time, after school, and even on the weekends, he scheduled as many shifts as he could and worked hard. And then, when it came time for his payday, he would hand the entire salary over to me. This is the money that you work so hard for, so you don't need to give it to me. You can manage it all yourself, Thomas.
But then we're going to struggle with our living expenses, right? I'm totally fine. So I want you to hold on to it, Mom. Seriously, take it.
And he insisted giving me his entire paycheck every month. However, thanks to that, my son and I were able to live a normal life, and after that, I also increased my shifts on my part-time job. By the time my son was in junior high school, we were able to live a stable life and support ourselves. And then, as time went on all these years, my son and mine got married, and not long after that, his wife became pregnant with their first child. Because my son grew up with such a twisted household, my son was afraid of getting married and having his own family. But that person that became his wife was able to move him, and he was able to convince him to marry her. She was such a wonderful person. They were able to give birth to their baby. My son and his wife told me that they wanted to move in with me. But after everything that happened with my ex-mother-in-law, I was hesitant. I'm not going to go to your house unless you invite me over there. And also, I'm not going to force you to come over here either. So you guys could just come over whenever it is that you want to see me, or whenever you want to come over, even if it's because you need money or help with anything at all. That's what I told my son and his wife. Not long after that, my son and his wife actually moved into my house. I was shocked by the sudden change of events, but this is what my son said to me.
You told us that we can come and see you whenever we want to see you, right? Both my wife and I want to see you every day, Mom. That's why we want to be here every day.
When they said that to me, the tears started streaming down my face. Even though I tried so hard to reject living together with my son and his wife, when they said that to me, I couldn't help the tears that was streaming down my face, and it made me realize how naive I was all this time, and how grateful I was for my new family. Then immediately after that, in the blink of an eye, my son and his wife moved into our family home. Once the dust had settled and we were able to live comfortably, I finally decided to ask them why they chose to live together with me, especially because seeing me and my ex-husband live together with his mother, he saw that he never wanted to be more than he should have, and I know that it scared him as well. But then it turns out that it's actually his wife's idea. She was the one that answered me.
If you only had the experience of being with a difficult family, then we want you to experience having a happy family. And if we could do that for you, then we would love to.
That's what she said. She was such an amazing woman. So much so, I almost think that she was a waste on my son. From there, we began to live our lives together. We didn't tread on each other's lives, and I was also able to help with the chores around the house. Especially because my son's wife was pregnant, I made sure that she wasn't pushing herself too hard. And I tried to support her as much as I could, while she helped out around the house. Personally, I was worried what would happen if we lived together. I quickly found out that all of those thoughts were ridiculous, because this was great. My son's wife was almost the most positive person I had ever met, and she was like a ray of sunshine. Being with her every day, I couldn't help but find myself in laughter. Apparently, that's when my son fell in love with her as well. As we continued on with our lives together, the days flew by, and before we knew it, my grandchild was born. I never thought 1 in a million years that I would have my own grandchild, but the baby girl that my son and his wife gave birth to was so cute that I couldn't handle it. For my ex-husband that I divorced, ever since the day that we got a divorce, I hadn't seen him once. I once confirmed with my son as well whether he wanted to stay in contact with him, but his response was, that was it. For my son, it was probably that unforgivable of a situation with my mother-in-law and ex-husband. Back then, my mother-in-law was still alive. Every day was such a struggle and so painful that I just tried to think of it away, and I could get through each day as quickly as possible. And yet, who could have imagined that my future was going to be so full of happiness like this? However, I knew that happiness was a result of my son and every single one of the actions that he took in order to create this peace. And I was grateful to him from the bottom of my heart. That's why from now on, I'm going to treasure myself and my family for the rest of my life.
How was today's video? If you enjoyed it, please subscribe, like, and leave a comment. Stay tuned for more.